On Friday, I went as an invited guest of my friend Steve Schwartz, who I have been working with for many years as an advisory board member of his organization, the Interfaith Sustainable Food Collaborative, working on building a sustainable local food system, or having a role in doing that by engaging faith communities across our region, mosques and synagogues and churches and Sikh temples and so forth. To the annual Earth Day breakfast hosted by our congressional representative, the Honorable Jared Huffman, out at Terra Firma Farms on the outskirts of Petaluma. So, yeah, I put on my clerical collar and went out to hang out on a beautiful morning and eat a delicious breakfast along with a whole bunch of environmentalists, people from government agencies like the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, our local agricultural commissioner, and then, you know, representatives of various nonprofits from the Sierra Club and the Marin Conservation League down to our little local outfits like, well, St. John's Episcopal Church. And we got to hear from the congressman after we'd all introduced each other to each other about the various things that he's been trying to get done in Congress to address the climate crisis and other aspects of the ecological catastrophe. And you know, being a politician, he was accentuating the positive. And there is, you know, some good news to be shared about things that have been accomplished in the last couple of years, some pretty significant legislation that's been passed, and he was describing ways that these federal expenditures would be available to our local community, various programs to help conserve water and restore wetlands and riparian areas, and put young people out on the land to learn more about ecological systems and all the good values that come along with that kind of education, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there were a lot of things that didn't get said. But one of our local heroes, a neighbor of ours who I've gotten to know over the years, who has a small nonprofit that encourages people to take action in their own daily lives and households to replace their lawns with mulch and take the gray water from their washing machines and put it out on the landscape, and other good things like that. Spoke up during the question and answer period, and he said, you know, it's great that we're doing all these things to help restore the natural systems and to make positive changes to our built infrastructure. But I'm concerned about our social infrastructure. How do we rebuild community? How do we strengthen the relationships between people? How do we find the energy to keep doing this kind of work when we're competing for what seems to be an ever-diminishing pool of volunteers and money, and people are just kind of burned out after the pandemic and exhausted and demoralized and can't really fault the congressman for not having a good answer to that question, because it's not really the kind of thing you can legislate in Congress, is it? So after the whole thing was over, I went up to my friend who'd asked that question, and I just complimented him on the question. Because as a religious leader, it's the kind of thing I think about a lot. And while the Congress may not be in a position necessarily to invest directly in rebuilding our social infrastructure, although I suppose there are public policy measures and government expenditures that could contribute to that effort, still, it's kind of up to places like St. John's Episcopal Church to figure that one out. If only people really understood that a little better, perhaps, and appreciated that we have, well, 2,000 years of experience in maintaining social infrastructure in communities like this one. But anyway, we won't go there. Anyway, and then as we were talking, another friend of ours, who likewise works in a little grassroots nonprofit here in Petaluma that she directs, that has a community farm that helps to feed hungry people in our community and does a lot of volunteer service learning for young people, teaching them about how to grow food and that kind of thing. She came up to us and said, yeah, can I ask you guys something? How do you sustain hope? How do you keep going when it seems like even the people who are trying to do the right thing are struggling to make do with resources that are scarce and keep, struggling with their sense of disappointment and frustration with the limitations? How do you maintain hope, and how do you lead in a system that is broken? And I said, well, that's that's a really good question. And probably in order to begin to do justice to that question, rather than, trying to give you a 5-minute answer, we should probably take a walk together sometime and talk it over at length, because I do have some thoughts on the subject. And that's really kind of how I like to process big questions like that, whether by myself or with other people. It's to take a walk. Just the other day, I got together with a friend of mine who recently stepped down from the Petaluma City Council, and after losing her bid to become the next mayor of Petaluma, is trying to figure out what she does next with her life and her gifts and talents. And we went for a long walk together around the neighborhood with no particular destination in mind. Had a good conversation. So that's where we encounter these two disciples of Jesus on the afternoon of the resurrection, taking a walk together from Jerusalem out to some place called Emmaus, wherever that is, and nobody really seems to know for sure. But that's not exactly the point. The point is they needed to take a walk and talk together about what had happened. What had happened to Jesus, what had happened that morning with the women who went to the tomb and came back with this very strange and baffling report. What had happened to their hope that Jesus was the one to redeem Israel, a prophet mighty in word and deed before God and all the people, who had awakened so much hope for the possibilities of renewing their community, of breathing new life into their social infrastructure, so that at last, perhaps, they would be able to live into the fullness of what God had promised to them and to their children, to live together in relationships of justice and equity and mutual embrace and affirmation. What had happened to that hope when the chief priests and the leaders of the people handed him over to the Gentiles to be condemned to death and nailed to a cross? So they're walking along, talking about it, and this stranger comes alongside and wants to know, what are you talking about? I'm taking a walk too today. And we seem to be walking in the same direction. And I can't help noticing how deeply engrossed you are in your conversation. So I can't just, I don't mean to pry, but what are you talking about? Well, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been happening lately? The big news that's all over town about Jesus? And so they proceed to kind of give their summary of what it is that they think has happened, what they think has happened. And the stranger kind of nods and hears about Jesus and all the great things that he did and the hope that they had in him, and then what happened to him, and then about the women who went to the tomb and found no body there, but met a messenger of God with this baffling news that the person that had been tortured and mutilated and hung on the cross for an afternoon and then taken down and put in a tomb was really alive. And then he says something to the effect of, well, that's actually not what happened. Or to put it another way, something else happened. Something that was happening all along. It just only appeared to be something different. Something that God was doing in this person, Jesus. Something that God's been preparing to do from the very beginning. And all of the prophets, beginning with Moses, all the people who spoke to you about hope, all the people who gave you the commandments about how to build the kind of social infrastructure that sustains hope and grows hope and lives on hope. They were all talking about this thing that God was going to do, that God is doing, that God will do in God's Messiah. And they didn't really even notice it at the time, certainly didn't remark on it to each other, but something in their hearts woke up and started to burn in response to what the stranger had to say. And when they got to Emmaus, got to the place where they were going, and it was time to stop walking and to have a bite to eat, to hunker down for the night, they extended hospitality to that stranger. They did what Jesus might have done. And they invited him to come in and have a bite to eat with them, as Jesus used to do with all kinds of people, strangers, friends, enemies, notorious sinners, Pharisees and scribes, and you name it. They invited this stranger to come in and have a bite to eat, and even to spend the night. And they asked him to say the blessing, the traditional blessing over the bread as they began the meal. And he took the bread, and he broke it, and he blessed it, and he gave it to them, just as Jesus did with his disciples on the night before he died. Just as he did with the one who was to betray him, to the one who was to deny him, to the ones who would run away from him in fear in his hour of need. Just as he took bread and blessed it and broke it with those people, he blessed and broke and shared bread with them. And in that moment, their eyes were opened and they recognized the risen body of Jesus, the Messiah, the one of whom all the scriptures speak. The Messiah who had to suffer, not because God wanted him to suffer, but because anyone who comes into the world as a stranger to address a system that is broken with hope, with nothing but hope for people, with unconditional love for people, with an affirmation and embrace of people, that is willing to accept their exclusion of him, their mistreatment, their misunderstanding, all their projections, all of their impatience, all of their sin, to embrace it and not to retaliate in kind, but to continue to reach out to them with love. Anyone like that, especially one who does so with utter conviction and inner authority and even divine power, is going to suffer because the system is broken. It is organized around exclusion, around one person having power over another and diminishing the humanity of that person by whatever criteria seem to fit the bill. It's a broken system, and only one intervention can save us from it. God's intervention of peace. So, that's a lot to absorb. And Jesus didn't stick around to explain it further. He'd already said everything he needed to say. And once they recognized his risen body, once they had noted how their hearts had burned when he opened the scriptures to them, once they understood that in searching those scriptures together, they could encounter him alive, once they understood that in breaking bread together with strangers of all kinds, they could recognize his living body, they knew all they needed to know. And they needed to take another walk to think it all through. In fact, they needed to go back to the scene of the crime. They walked all the way back to Jerusalem in the dusk and into the dark to go back to the place where these things that had happened to Jesus had happened. To find those people who had run away in fear in his hour of need. The people who had denied him his own, to whom he had returned alive, to give them the power of hope, the power to sustain and to strengthen and to grow social capital and cohesion and community, not founded on exclusion and violence and the superiority of the in-group over the out-group, but founded on God's unconditional love and embrace for all humanity and all creation, as Jesus had manifested it to them on the cross and in the tomb.